Hey, everybody. My guest today is Professor Serena Parekh, and we're going to talk about the global refugee crisis. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be here, Jason.
Okay, so I think a good way to do this is first for you to describe what the crisis is, and then we can get into the ethics of it.
Sounds good. There are a couple of different ways of thinking about the crisis. And one way to think about that is to ask the question, a crisis for whom? Those of us who live in Western countries are used to hearing about the refugee crisis from the point of view of our countries. Too many asylum seekers trying to get over the border, too many refugees waiting to be resettled, too many economic migrants posing as refugees, trying to take advantage of our system. So the system is out of control, borders are out of control. We don't have autonomy over who is entering our countries, and this is the crisis. This is the problem that needs to be fixed. If by contrast you're a refugee, then the crisis is going to look very, very different. The crisis is that for all kinds of different reasons, people are being forced outside of their homes, outside of their home countries, and finding very, very few opportunities for genuine refuge, let alone the opportunity to start a new life, to resettle, to build a home somewhere. So the crisis for refugees is actually that there are very few places to go once you feel like you are forced to leave your home. I can talk a little bit about the numbers. Every year there's historically larger and larger groups of people who are either comprised the people who are called the forcibly displaced, which are people who are forced to leave their homes for all kinds of reasons, including climate change and war, and refugees and asylum seekers, which is a subset of that group. So a refugee is a person who is forced to flee their home because of persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. An asylum seeker is somebody who is in that group, a person who's experienced persecution, and comes directly to the country that they would like refugee status in and asks to be considered a refugee. Because they are on the territory of this other country, they actually have a special right, which is the right of non-refoulement, which means that states cannot send them back to the country that they feared persecution in. So they have a certain right to remain, a right to stay on the territory, at least while their asylum claim is being heard. And in all Western countries, the process of adjudicating asylum claims takes years rather than months. So oftentimes people end up living informally for years. And then whether or not they receive a positive or negative decision, they end up staying because at that point they have jobs, they have lives, they have families, they have children, etc. So that's also part of the crisis that the numbers are larger and the systems that have been set up to respond to them are inadequate to the task.
Okay, so I kind of want to get clarification on these terms. A refugee refers to a person who has been forced to leave their home country due to war, maybe poverty, discrimination, persecution, something like that. Yeah. And
Can I
it's,
stop you for a second?
yeah,
So it's really interesting that you phrased it like that because I think that's what most people think of as a refugee. And I think two of the categories you mentioned are particularly important: people who are fleeing war and people who are fleeing poverty. For the most part, Western states do not consider people fleeing poverty to be refugees. So poverty isn't a basis that you can claim refugee status on. It has to be persecution on the basis of one of the protected grounds. War is an interesting category because many people think, of course, you're a refugee if you're fleeing war. That's true. Many countries will acknowledge that, especially in some cases. But technically, people fleeing war are not refugees unless they're fleeing because they are persecuted, not just because of generalized violence. And unfortunately, people fleeing poverty are considered economic migrants, and precisely the people that Western states want to keep from accessing the refugee and asylum system.
okay. So then an asylum seeker is not necessarily a refugee. Is that correct?
An asylum seeker is a person who wants to be considered a refugee, who wants to receive refugee status.
Okay, an asylum seeker is a person who's seeking refugee status, but not all refugees, obviously not all refugees are asylum seekers, nor all refugees could be asylum seekers. Is that correct?
That's right. Most refugees remain in refugee camps in countries proximate to the countries they're fleeing from. The vast majority, over 85% of refugees are not asylum seekers. It's actually a very small group of people who are asylum seekers relative to the number of people who are displaced from their homes.
Okay, so then those people who are seeking asylum or in the process of seeking asylum, are they just more, quote unquote, privileged in relation to the other refugees who don't try or can't try?
Yeah, in some ways, absolutely. So there are people who tend to have more social capital. They tend to not be disabled. They tend to be able-bodied, which is often why we see, young single men coming over, which looks suspicious. Why are those single men coming over? But actually, it's because they're considered a kind of investment for their family. If one son can make it to Europe, then eventually he can have the rest of the family brought over to safety. So they're privileged in that sense. It is because the process of seeking asylum has become so complex. It is often very expensive and requires the use of smugglers. So that does require some savings. But I will say it's not necessarily that they're wealthy or they're even that they're middle class. Oftentimes, families will pool resources to try to get one person to Europe or to Australia or to the United States, in the hopes that that would allow him to get legal status and then to bring over the rest of the family.
Okay. So in regards to this concept of a refugee, they have to be the victim of persecution in order for them to be considered a refugee. So even if there's a war going on, if they're not being persecuted, they're not a refugee if they leave because of the war.
Yeah, yes and no. So technically, that's correct. It doesn't fall within the Geneva Convention of a refugee, but in many circumstances, countries will acknowledge that this is the case. So people fleeing Ukraine were considered refugees immediately. The United Nations considers people fleeing from certain conflict situations to be de facto refugees. But if you're a refugee in a refugee camp and you're fleeing war, it might not be a reason that the United States would recognize you as a refugee.
Okay. So these refugees, you're saying that vast majority of them are not seeking asylum in in other countries. They're in refugee camps.
Correct.
And those refugee camps are in neighboring countries?
That's right. So they're almost entirely in the global south, proximate to the countries that are experiencing crises. So think of whatever recent crisis you have in mind. Maybe think about Afghanistan, where when the United States launched the war in Afghanistan, created all kinds of instability. Millions of people fled Afghanistan to Pakistan, which now has some of the largest refugee populations in the world. Ironically, a lot of people were able to go back once Afghanistan was more stabilized, when the United States was still present in the United States, sorry, in Afghanistan. When the United States left Afghanistan again, people were made refugees and forced to go to Pakistan because of the oppression of the Taliban. So you have millions of Afghan refugees in Pakistan, for example. You have millions of Sudanese refugees in Kenya. So they tend, I mean, if you think about it, most refugees, you know, grab their belongings in the middle of the night, pack up what they can, flee largely on foot, maybe with some kind of transportation. So they're going to end up going to the first place that will give them food, shelter, clean water, a place to stay. And those are often in camps that are set up and run by the United Nations.
Okay. And I suspect that the conditions of these camps are not very good.
They're not very good, exactly. So they're set up to provide immediate relief, and in some sense, they very much do that. You're fleeing for your life. Maybe you've experienced torture. Maybe you've experienced seeing your family members killed, and you arrive at a camp, and they say, "Welcome. Here's food. Here's some medical care. Here's a place to sleep." It can be great. It's exactly what the international community was intending to do with these refugee camps. The problem is that they were always meant to be temporary. They were meant to be short-term solutions that would allow refugees to live in safety for a brief period of time, then to either resettle in that country, return to their home country, or be resettled by a third party country in the case where those first two options weren't available. The problem is that starting in about the 1980s and the early 1990s, conflicts grew more global in nature and intensified, and so tended to endure for much longer. So the result is that most refugees are refugees in refugee camps for about 17 years. So over 17 years, just having 1,000 calories worth of food and a place to sleep on the ground is not sufficient. There are camps, for example, at Dadaab in Kenya, where you have generations of refugees who would have lived in a refugee camp, um, and had children in the refugee camp, and then their children would have had children. And again, the problem is not merely the lack of material resources, so little food, very poor shelter. It's really the lack of autonomy. You don't get to choose where you live. You're not able to work to earn a living, to take care of your family. You have to be kind of passive recipients of international aid. And that's very, very hard for people. I mean, I think most people can imagine what it would be like just to live off of what other people give you and not be able to get an education, get a job, develop your talents, move where you want to move to. So very, very difficult. So it's in part the lack of resources and in part the fact that this has become a kind of long-term solution to many of the refugee crises.
So those countries that are offering their, I guess, their land for these refugee camps, are they not willing to kind of turn these refugees into citizens?
Correct. That's exactly right. And for a lot of different reasons. Maybe the most generous way of explaining it is to say they are themselves poor countries, and they feel this is an obligation they have to maybe people who are ethnically similar, religiously similar, in some way connected to them, but they simply couldn't allow millions and millions of people to become citizens overnight. And it's connected to a different problem, which is that in a world of profound global inequality and global poverty, if countries did that, it might serve as a pull factor so that people would come and say, well, I'm a refugee. Let me try living in Kenya and see how that goes instead of, Eritrea or, Mali or somewhere else. So the fear of economic migrants being seen as refugees is also part of what limits that. And another factor is a lot of countries are actually not wholly accepting refugees from the goodwill of their heart. A lot of it is geopolitics. And as I've heard people in the global south say, a sense of being coerced by countries in the global north. For example, Bangladesh hosts over 1 million Rohingya refugees. And Rohingya refugees are the refugees that are being persecuted in Myanmar. They're ethnically Muslim. The dominant group in Myanmar are Buddhist. And despite having lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years, they're perceived as foreigners, as outsiders. So for the last 20 plus years, they've been the victims of ethnic cleansing. And when times when that's peaked, people have left in masses. And after experiencing enormous atrocities, villages razed to the ground, torture, brutality, murder, and in large numbers. So over 1 million people have fled in the last 10 years. Bangladesh is very close, religiously similar, so they've gone there. But Bangladesh is itself both very poor and very fragile in the sense of being susceptible to climate change. So they can't just absorb 1 million refugees without it putting tremendous strain on the ecosystem there. They have felt like they've been forced to. They have felt that the United States has said, look, if you want these development dollars, you will take in Rohingya refugees. So they've sort of unwillingly done this. But again, no other country has been willing to. No one else has resettled them. It's in no way clear that they're able to go back to Myanmar because their lives are still at risk. So it's a very bad situation. So in many ways, one of the crises you asked about is that nobody wants to take responsibility for refugees. In some ways, we can understand why. That's a big responsibility. It's expensive. It's a lot of people. It risks attracting more people. On the other hand, you have these incredibly vulnerable people who have suffered profoundly and really have no ability to live their lives in peace and security.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a fair comparison, but the way that you're describing it is kind of like, I don't know, like foster kids. Maybe like the vast majority of people don't want to adopt foster kids. They think that they're just trouble, or they feel like they can't really provide and they don't have the resources to deal with that type of situation. Perhaps somebody with a history of trauma, right? And so they just end up in some sort of like terrible system where they just stay in perpetually.
Yeah, I think that's what's great. In some ways you can imagine a refugee camp like a group home with all of the problems and all of the lack of resources that are entailed in that. And what I was just describing about Bangladesh would be almost like saying to a welfare recipient, well, you can't have your welfare unless you take in two foster children. And you can imagine, they're not going to devote a lot of their resources to those foster children because they themselves are poor. This is an unwilling arrangement that they're not super happy about. For the foster kids, it might be the best. I mean, it's better than being dead. It's better than being left to float on sea without any resources. So it's something, but overall, it's not good for anybody. Yet it's the kind of collective action problem that's so hard to address.
So what do you think the solution is?
I don't think there's one solution. I think there are different ways we can look at some of the harms that are ongoing in the global refugee system. So I think philosophers look at this in two ways. You could have an ideal theory where we come up with, what ought states to do with refugees exactly, and how many should you take, and how should we have a system that's carved out in certain ways. Another way would be to approach it from the perspective of non-ideal theory and just say, look, we're in a world where there are millions of refugees. A limit constraint is that liberal democracies do not see it as being in their interest to take in large numbers, adequate numbers of refugees. And because of global poverty and the kind of inequalities and poverty power that go along with that, the result is going to be that people live in the poorest countries take in the largest number of refugees. Can we make this a little bit better? And I think we can. A lot of my book talks about how we might think of our moral obligations to refugees in this larger context. Most philosophers writing about refugees write about the first set of questions. What are the obligations of liberal states to take in refugees? On what basis? You know, how stringent is the duty? How far does it extend? When can we say that we've done enough? On the other side, what arguments can we give for saying that, our obligations to refugees are limited? What I want to say is that if we think about this larger global context, we can see that we might have obligations not only to take in refugees, but to think about how the different structures in the world are set up to provide refuge or to not provide refuge. The incentives that are given to countries in the global south, can they be reimagined so that they are actually providing refuge, perhaps local integration, opportunities for work? And there's been a lot of work in the social sciences, refugee studies, political science to imagine these alternatives. For example, rather than refugee camps being places where refugees cannot work, you often have people desperate to work, strong, healthy, able to work. You're often in countries that would benefit from labor. How could you match that up so that refugees are able to work while they are refugees? Um, Jordan had an experiment where companies that employed a certain percentage of refugees got special trading status with the European Union. So this allowed large numbers of refugees to come into the workforce. Uganda has always allowed refugees to work. So when you become a refugee in Uganda, you're given a plot of land, you're given, work, what we would call work permits, the ability to work. And the result is often that refugees are extraordinarily productive. They produce things for Ugandans as well as the refugee community and feel a deeper sense of autonomy because they're at least doing something, they can be enterprising, they are working, which is what most refugees would like to be doing. So there are different ways we can imagine that. And then the question for Western states is, well, what could we be doing that would encourage refugees to live lives of dignity while they are refugees? So we might not have an overall solution. Where's everyone going to go? How's it all going to work? But you can imagine more ethical and humane ways of providing assistance to refugees and providing support to the countries that are helping refugees.
And do you think that we have an obligation to take more in?
I do think we have an obligation to take more in. So almost any moral theory that you can apply to the refugee system, the answer is we ought to be taking more in. How many more? To what extent? I do think that's an open question and one that requires democratic deliberation. But democratic deliberation on honest terms, I think that the ways we have debates at the moment are dishonest. They're based on scare tactics. They're based on a sort of dehumanized view of refugees. I mean, we just have to think about the discourse in the last US presidential election to see, to get a really deep sense of this. If we're going to have a debate over how many refugees we should take in and we portray refugees as degraded criminals, violent, that's really going to change how people perceive our obligations to refugees. If we remind people that refugees are much less likely to commit crime than native born citizens, which is true, that refugees are likely to be economic um, gains rather than drains after a certain number of years, also something that is true. All the gains that we've had in multiculturalism, the ways that different perspectives bring to the economy to drive certain innovations and drive certain other economic indicators. People are genuinely more open to refugees specifically and immigrants more broadly. And so I think democratic deliberation is a part of the answer to this, but on really constrained terms.
I find it interesting that the reasons that you cited for these poorer countries not to kind of integrate these refugees are the exact same reasons why the United States doesn't want to accept more asylum seekers. It's just like, well, they're going to be an economic burden. We have to deal with our own stuff first. Maybe there are cultural and religious differences that we don't really want to see affecting our society. I find that to be
Yeah,
interesting. Like everyone's the same in a sense, right?
everyone's the same, absolutely. And I think those reasons touch on something important to people. Every country wants to feel a sense of control over its country. Nobody wants to feel like they're being forced to do something they don't want to do or forced to take in people that are going to change the composition of the country in a bad way. So I think that is actually a really important thing to acknowledge. But I think once we do acknowledge it, it doesn't mean that we have to take those arguments at face value. It might actually be true that Bangladesh can't take in 1 million Rohingya refugees without substantial economic problems. It is not true that the United States can't take in 100,000 asylum seekers. And we know that with decades of evidence. And we also know that the asylum seekers, the way the US system integrates asylum seekers, they are actually economic gains, not economic burdens. So while every country is to feel like they're worried about asylum seekers, it's actually not true that they impact all countries negatively. In some countries, in fact, positively. It's also, when I hear the argument that, well, the United States, we don't want Muslim refugees, we don't want certain kinds of refugees, meaning non-white refugees. Um, we're a multicultural country, and we have been since the foundation of the country. And it's been a country that was founded with the labor of slaves. It's been a country that developed because of immigrants coming in over time, changing character of the country. So to say now, well, we don't want people who are different than us. Well, the us is itself a very contested concept, and one that is at least arguably and plausibly should be understood as multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are willing to grant the diversity of the history of the United States and also its current, demographic makeup. I think what people are worried about is maybe kind of like a large increase of a certain type of people that will then dramatically change the kind of like the political and cultural and social landscape of the country, right? So if it were
Yeah.
the case that let's say that you had like 10 different countries and you had refugees coming in from 10 different countries, if they were all relatively proportionate, then I think the worry would be less so than if all of them came from one particular country.
Is that a worry though? Like, are you thinking of a specific example of one country overwhelming the United States?
Yeah, no, I was just using that as a hypothetical to represent, I think, the concerns that a lot of people have. So, for instance, like I'm from Los Angeles, right? Los Angeles is extremely diverse, right? Half of the city is Latino, you know. But in LA though, you have so many different people that people just kind of have to mix. Like it just in the city where I grew up, like the suburb of LA, it was very diverse, right? So like everybody had to speak English to each other, right? But if you have a community that was large enough, they could maintain their native language for a longer period of time, and I think there would be forces that could resist assimilation.
I think that's absolutely true. We don't have a lot of empirical evidence that that's what happens. Other countries, it's a little bit different. But if you are in the United States, you are very unlikely to find a school that would only speak Polish, for example, so that you do actually have those in Canada, so you might be able to resist assimilating for longer. But children tend to assimilate very, very quickly. I mean, I don't know if you're the children of immigrants, but immigrant children tend to want to be like the native population very, very quickly. So I don't want to underestimate the challenges that go with multiculturalism. Certainly, every country has its own history and particularities. But I also don't want to concede the argument that that worry that you described is a worry that ought to be morally salient in discussions about how many refugees we should let in, though it often is. And I think, unfortunately, it's often a disguise for racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, to say that, like, look, if we let in people from, Syria, like, we are going to be taken over by Muslim fundamentalists. And again, we just don't have any, like, the numbers aren't large enough to do that. We don't have any sociological, political science. We don't have any evidence that that tends to happen. But it is a worry, and it's a worry that easily feeds into people's sense of fear or anxiety, worry about cultural difference. And I think it is interesting that in many multicultural places, there has actually been a backlash towards immigrants and refugees, as we saw in the last election, even by immigrants themselves. Another interesting question is like a lot of places in the United States, and we can stay there for a minute, are not multicultural. So you have rural communities across the United States that are by and large predominantly white. What effect would allowing refugees to resettle there have on those communities? And it's a really interesting question because often those are the communities that themselves are in need of immigrants. So they're the communities that need workers to work in factories, to work in slaughterhouses, to work in farms, very, very much. So, so there's no question that it would change the character of places, but would it change it for the worst? I think that's the question that would require some really honest deliberation, conversations, and to be open to hearing perspectives of everyone. Like I take it that people don't like it when they see what they've considered to be their home for years or generations change in fundamental ways. And that's absolutely an important thing to keep in mind. On the other hand, they often tend to be places that are economically declining, that need more infusion of people, that need more places, more people to come and live and buy and spend and so forth. So, can there be a way of understanding these two perspectives that would allow for, more openness?
Yeah, yeah. I feel like this issue, maybe the vast majority of people share a particular type of concern. Okay. But then you have these radicals that take that concern and just kind of run with it. And they just take it to the extreme and they're politically motivated. And that's where kind of the fear mongering comes in. Right. So in a sense, that's why it's successful because it touches upon a real concern that non-extremists also have, which is some sort of like familiarity. People like familiarity. I think generally speaking. So, in your work, do you ever talk about rights? Do you ever go into this notion of rights? Like, does the state have a right to control its borders? Do refugees have a right to, seek asylum in other countries and get asylum in other countries?
Absolutely. No, I think you're right. So let me just touch on the first part that you said that what extremists do is to touch on a core truth that many people share and exploit it. And I think that's absolutely right. And it's why refugees and immigrants have become such a cultural touchstone. On the other hand, I think what philosophers can do is the same, right? To touch on a moral core in people, which says that all human beings deserve to live with a minimal level of dignity. And that's what we can touch on to say, like, are we sure that we're comfortable with this treatment of refugees? Are we sure that we're okay with detaining, families, children, putting them in detention centers, or, worse, sending them to prisons? And I actually think that when I have conversations with people, if you can get people to acknowledge that, it's the same. It touches on something that's true. And if we can build on that, if you will, I think it can be an antidote to the sort of extremist using of the truth on the other side. Do I talk about rights? Absolutely. So I think there are many philosophers who believe in open borders, who think that states do not have a right to control their border. Um, I actually am persuaded by the arguments that say that democratic communities ought to be able to control their border, but being constrained by human rights. So being able to control your border doesn't mean you can shoot people who try to come in that you don't like, or you can torture them so that they are discouraged from trying again. So we can control our borders, but we're still constrained by human rights. Asylum seekers have a right to seek asylum. They don't have a right to receive asylum. At least that's how it's understood in the UN Declaration on Human Rights, which says that Article 16 says all human beings have a right to seek and enjoy asylum, but they deliberately leave out a right to receive asylum. So you have a right to seek asylum, and what that means is you have a right to go to other countries, say, look, I've been tortured, I've seen my family killed, we have documented evidence that people from my ethnic group are being killed. If you send me back, I too will be tortured and killed. And they have a right to have that heard. And if it's true and if like that can be acknowledged, they have a right then to asylum, however the country in question decides to proceed. I think at the end of the day, the most basic question of rights is what human rights are refugees entitled to? Rights, human rights or civil rights, come from the state, and refugees are people who cannot count on their own state to protect their human rights. So this is actually precisely what human rights discourse was designed to address. Well, every human being has rights. So, how do we make sure the human rights of refugees are protected? How can we ensure that refugees live with the kind of minimal human dignity that human rights were intended to protect? And I don't think anyone disagrees with that. I think the disagreement is just, well, it's not me. That's asking too much. Other people should do it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. I've spoken with a number of libertarian philosophers, and I know libertarians tend to be in favor of open borders, or at least something closer to open borders. They're still sympathetic to the idea that, we can deport criminals, right? So there are going to be some restrictions in place. And one move that they often will make is that they will compare national borders to state borders, right? So just like somebody from California can come to Ohio, like somebody from Mexico should be able to come into the United States. Do you reject that? And if you do, why?
Yeah. It's funny that you asked that. I'm just preparing a lecture on Michael Walzer, who wrote about is this exact phenomenon, right? What would happen if national borders became more like state borders or even more like community borders, where all you needed to enter was basically economic credential. You could buy a house, you could get a job, then you could come and live. He says, okay, fine, let's imagine that. At some point, the community is going to want to make certain decisions. My community, we want to give all children access to free, excellent education. Great. Where does that community extend? How far are you going to go? Are you going to try to educate just every child who happens to be like that's not really possible. So you have to be able to demarcate, okay, my community ends on this street. And then this street is this town and this street is this other town. And it's only going to extend to people who live on this side of the border. And then what you'll have is what he calls 1,000 petty fortresses. So every community then is going to have to hunker down and prevent outsiders from coming in. And you will have on the community level what you have on the national level. That's if you want to do things as a community, if you want to make decisions, if you want to distribute goods, such as education, healthcare, paved roads. We need communities to have distributive justice. And the primary question of communities is who can be a member. And answering that question requires closure at some point. So it could be that we put up borders around my town and you have to have a special knock to get in. Or we do it at the border, which is how we have it now set up. Either way, in order to be the kind of agents that we are as human beings, the kind of agents that want to act collectively with other people, we need some kind of closure. He also makes a slightly different point, which is that the reason we value community so much is because it's so crucial for our identity. And what matters to us is not just that we're human beings, but that we're human beings from a certain place. You drew on your own experience earlier that we have a kind of identity, that we have a kind of bond with other people. I come also from a multicultural community, and our bond is that like we come from a multicultural community and we're all different and we all grew up with this experience of hearing other languages spoken, eating really interesting food. And like that's part of who I am. And I don't want to give that up. And Walser thinks that, denying that reality means that we'd have radically deracinated men and women who don't feel at home anywhere because you have no sense of who your community is or where it ends or where it extends to. And I do feel like that's somewhat compelling. So I think he's right that we need closure at some point. And that question of who is going to be a member becomes one of the primary political questions.
Hmm. I'm trying to think of like how that would apply in like the state to state context, right? So I used to live in California, now I live in Ohio, and the reason why I can reap certain benefits from Ohio is because I pay taxes in Ohio and not in California anymore. So why wouldn't that equally apply for national borders?
So the reason you can move from California to Ohio is because we have national borders or we have a constraint on who can enter at all. So you get certain benefits from being in Ohio. Maybe you get universal healthcare. I don't think that's true, but say you do. Um, if there wasn't the case that there was closure at some point, and Ohio was one state out of 50 that gave free universal health care, every person with a difficult condition would be moving to Ohio. If all you needed to do was to go there and then pay taxes, then you could be a member of this incredible state that would give you cradle to grave health care. It probably would be unaffordable. And then further, the people who are paying taxes would say, wait, why am I paying taxes for somebody who doesn't live, or who's coming in here, who's maybe I don't identify with, I don't know. Like, why would I have? So the basis of social justice, at least to some extent, is that we feel a sense of identity with the people that we're helping. We don't mind paying taxes because we know it's going into a system where other people are getting healthcare, getting education, and so forth. So that becomes weaker if there's not a constraint in some way. But I think that question of like, without some way of closing it off, the benefit you get from being in Ohio would be nullified.
Well, couldn't we just make economic changes such that it wouldn't happen? Right? Like if the worry is that all these people are going to come to Ohio and take advantage of universal healthcare, um, and that they are paying taxes, but it's not enough, then wouldn't the response be to raise taxes? Like that's one response, right?
Raise taxes on the people living there.
Yeah. Or maybe
Um,
other people who are, like, coming in, like, I feel like there's, like, there could be an economic case to be made, right? Why is it economically and morally speaking for me to move from California to Ohio, but not me to move to Canada? Like, why can't we just do the same thing? I pay taxes in Ohio now, and then, let's say tomorrow I move to Canada, and then I start paying taxes in Canada, and then I can take advantage of their benefits as well, and if they have greater benefits, then I pay more taxes.
I mean, it's hard to look at that as just on the level of the individual. So, what would happen if every American who needed health care could just go to Canada and pay taxes? I guess is one way to ask that question. What would Canada as a country serve to lose? Because it's not that Canadians are going to be going to the United States. Well, Canadians are going to be there anyway. So I guess, in a world of profound inequality, the countries that are resource rich are going to risk attracting people to such an extent that they would. So why not just tax everyone so much that they can afford, that Canada could afford to pay for all kinds of healthcare? Well, we know that doesn't. I mean, you can only tax people so much. You will also have to live and pay buy groceries and buy services, and the economy couldn't function if we tax people 90%. Companies would not be able to live to be there. Jobs wouldn't be able to be there. So I don't know that economically we could just tax people so much that we could have a system that could give free universal medical care to all people who live there.
Yeah, and there are other, like, practical problems as well, right? So if all those people move there, then housing prices are gonna go up, right? So then that's gonna prevent the number of people who are able to live in Canada from America, right? So I feel like there's, like, some economic equilibrium that will happen. I don't know. But so let's say that we do support some conception of open borders, right? Let's say we take the libertarian position. That doesn't seem to address the refugee crisis, right? Because an open borders position is almost kind of like a negative right. Like the state is just not going to interfere with you coming over the border. But the problem with the vast majority of these refugees is that they cannot come here, right? Like they're stuck. They don't have the social capital or economic capital to do so.
Exactly. So open borders have never been a solution proposed for the refugee crisis for precisely that reason.
So then that tells me that what's needed is some sort of positive duty, right?
To help refugees,
Yes.
absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So then from the perspective of like the economically rich countries then, what do you think that positive duty would be? Like well like it and I guess I want to hear what you think about like ideal theory, right? Like what's the positive duty under ideal theory and what's a positive duty under non-ideal theory?
So I think under ideal theory, there is a strong case to be made that states have to resettle refugees as a duty. So right now, it's not considered a duty, it's just considered an act of benevolence, which is why so few countries actually resettle so few refugees. Less than 1% of refugees are resettled in a given year. If it were actually acknowledged to be a duty, and maybe one that was tied to capacity in some way, GDP, territory per person, things like that, and one that was shared widely, not just among the, OECD countries, but even among middle income countries. You could imagine, there's a little over 20 million refugees. Like, that's actually not a lot of people that need homes. So you could imagine that as being a way to solve the refugee crisis. It would also incentivize countries when they're thinking of military campaigns to think about how that's going to impact refugees, knowing that that's going to be a cost that will be part of their global calculation rather than an externality that they can ignore while they're planning geopolitics. So I think that works in ideal theory, absolutely. And I don't even think like doesn't even to me that didn't sound that far fetched. The problem is that every country wants other countries to do that first, and so that's one. And the second thing is, liberal democracies leaders are elected to fight for the needs of their citizens. And if you had a president who was like, look, guys, we got to help other people around the world. So we're going to take in, some X number of refugees. That's going to be good for us in all kinds of ways. You can imagine that being really politically unpopular. Like, well, why are you doing that for them? Why can't you help this rural community? Why can't you fight homelessness? Why can't you do these other things? So it's in non-ideal theory, the way that liberal democracies function is to say, like, you should take care of us, not other people. We used to, I think until very recently, we believed we had humanitarian obligations to other people, but also because it showed the best of our country. And that seems to have gotten diminished in the past few months as well. So the harder argument to make.
Do you think that that is a legitimate concern? Do you believe that that position is true, that a country has a higher obligation to take care of its own citizens first and then help others in other countries?
Yeah, it's a really good question and something that I've really thought a lot about. I actually do think so, right? So if you had a leader that was so concerned with the other people and not your own interests, you'd probably think like, well, what are you doing being my representative? Like you're supposed to represent my interests. I don't think they're necessarily incompatible. And I don't actually think the idea that you have to do this first and then you can turn to other people is necessarily how we should think about it, or how in fact we do think about it. There is a way in which you can address the needs of your constituents and the needs of other people. I think this was really brought to a head during the COVID pandemic. So all of a sudden we had all these vaccines that were accessible to us, and we were told it's because we were hoarding them. Countries in Africa and Asia, South America weren't going to get them as quickly as we were and as large quantities because our government, acting in our interest, negotiated with the drug makers to stockpile vaccines. We weren't sure how many we were going to need, how long they were going to last, et cetera, et cetera. And was that okay? Like, as I describe it, you think, of course, that's not okay. But at the time when you could see your grandfather dying and your children not going to school, it kind of felt okay. And it kind of felt like, yeah, of course, our government should be looking after its citizens, our economy, our health before looking at other countries. I think what we could have done is a more nuanced approach and said, absolutely, like we owe things to our citizens because we are representatives, but we can negotiate on terms of equality with other countries rather than sort of abusing our power and abusing our economic might and understanding that other countries do have legitimate interests in preserving the health and well-being of their own countries. So we can trade, we can negotiate, but to do it on terms that are a little bit more fair than the current way, which is like all mine. I'm gonna, punch you and get you out of the way so I can take all as much as I can take. That isn't what I'm talking about. It is a more nuanced approach where you're thinking about the interests of your own citizens, but balancing them with a concern for other people as human beings.
So I'm trying to get a good idea of what the solution or the solutions would look like the concrete solutions. So I think you said earlier that you think richer countries do have an obligation to take on more of these refugees. So that's pretty clear, right? But that would also mean that we have some sort of positive duty to pay for their transportation to come here.
We are already paying a lot. Like the whole refugee system is extremely expensive. Um, so paying for refugees to come over would be a drop in the bucket.
Oh, I see. Right now, you're saying that what the way that we're spending right now is how we're giving that money to other countries for them to take care of them?
Yeah, and to the UNHCR, that's the UN body that oversees refugee protection.
Okay. All right. So maybe instead of that, we pay for their transportation over so that they can be integrated into like the American society. So that would be one concrete solution.
Right.
Okay.
And I mean, I would even say like we are in fact paying the United Nations billions of dollars every year, but this would be more of an investment. We would bring people over, we would assimilate them, and then the data is like within 10 years, they're economically contributing um, more than anything they've been given from the government. So they're actually an investment, an economic investment.
Okay. All right. So what would be another concrete solution?
Well, you can imagine right now when we talk about rich countries, we think about the OECD countries, but a lot of the middle income countries, Brazil, India, China, don't actually play a large role in the refugee system. And there's no reason why they shouldn't, both in terms of resettlement, in terms of contributing more to the UNHCR budget. So that's another option. I mean, if we're taking like constraints off the table, the number of refugees that need to be resettled could easily be divided and resettled with minimum economic negative impact for any country. So the solutions are clear. I mean, or not clear maybe, but like not hard to imagine.
Yeah, okay. Do you ever talk about the role that other countries have to play in, like, meddling in other countries' affairs with which then eventually leads to a refugee crisis?
Absolutely. So one of the reasons we sometimes say that, the US has an obligation to refugees is because we've played in a direct role in causing the situation that have made them refugees in the first place. So in Pakistan, there are a lot of refugees who worked for and with the US government. So these are people who were directly made refugees, not just because of the war, but because we asked them for help as individuals and they could no longer live in Afghanistan because they would be targeted. So that's often seen as a basis for our obligations to refugees. I actually think we should look at things in a slightly bigger perspective. Why are poor countries poor? So this is a big question in global justice, one that is empirically complex, but minimally a plausible reason that's sort of widely accepted is because the economic disadvantage that we give to other countries when we are negotiating trade treaties, when we are negotiating resource distribution. And then, if you think of climate change and how that's disproportionately impacting the poorest countries, it's going to impact their economies. That we know leads to destabilization, which can in turn lead to war and other kinds of conflicts that cause refugee crises. So I think there's a deeper story to be told about the way that we have impacted countries that produce refugees, not just today, but I mean, starting in the colonial period, starting and then as well as in the sort of neo-colonial period where countries became functionally autonomous, but with very deep economic obligations to their former colonies, to the contemporary system of trade negotiations where people, do things in our terms because we leverage power against them for our interests, but that very much harm those countries. Fine, so what? But then it leads to destabilization, it leads to conflict, it leads to the kinds of crises that produce refugees.
Yeah, I think it's very complicated because there are a variety of causes that ultimately kind of contribute to this problem. And you may think because of that, there are numerous actions that these richer countries need to take to battle this, to battle this problem, right? Because it's really more of the economically rich and prosperous countries that have contributed more to climate change. So maybe we have a more obligation for that as well, right? We have an obligation maybe not to kind of like interfere in other people's internal politics, maybe, right? Like so, the obligation can take on many forms. That's what I'm hearing.
Absolutely, exactly. But to acknowledge that we play this causal role, I think, is the first step, and it's something that we are like, nope, absolutely not. We don't have a backward sense of responsibility and thinking about how things in the past might be impacting the present.
Yeah. I don't know what to do about the fact that all these people just don't want them. Like no country is just willing to take on these refugees. It just seems like such a tragic situation. Like it's the same thing with foster kids. It just seems like a very tragic situation. People seem to be aware of it, and yet it's just I don't know. Like as a species, we're just not good enough. We're not morally good enough to take on these problems. You know.
I agree. It's tragic and challenging, but I don't know. It's something we've dealt with in the past. It does seem like something that could be dealt with if indeed there was the political will, and I think the moral courage to actually address it and put it up as a problem worth addressing.
I feel like there are a couple of different problems that a philosopher can encounter. So one is that the stuff that they talk about, it's just nobody cares. It just really doesn't matter. They're just puzzle solving, right? It's like theoretical mathematics. And I'm like, okay, I mean, yeah, if you find that fulfilling, you should go do that. But it's just, that's not really for me. All right. So then there's other types of work, philosophical work that really is important. It addresses a big problem, right? And it's timely. But the problem is so big and complex that it seems insurmountable,
Right.
you know? And I feel like this refugee stuff is on like that end of the spectrum. Very relevant, very important, obviously tremendous amounts of suffering. Obviously, right? The exact opposite of the intellectual puzzle solving that other philosophers do. And that kind of frustrates me and kind of disheartens me that there are these type of issues that are important, but it just seems so hard to address that I feel like the solutions are there. We can imagine these solutions, but there's the core problem is that we are just not good enough as a species, you know? And so sometimes, like at least when I do my own philosophy, I try to find a problem that's somewhere somewhere
Somewhere
in
in the
the
middle.
middle. Yeah, it's like it's not that big of a problem, but it's also like maybe more surmountable. It's
Yeah,
just like so.
yeah. That's
I don't know, man.
solvable. I'd like to
Yeah.
try that sometime. That sounds like a good approach.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jason. It was great talking to you.
Thanks for tuning in to The Ethical Frontier. If you want to support my work, you can do so at patreon.com/chenphilosophy.